So the first practice I think we're going to share with you this evening, coaches, is what's called Fox in the Box. And I think the first bit that we want to highlight with this particular practice is we're going to adopt a methodology that we would call as coaches whole part whole. So what that means is for our session design is that we're going to start with the whole game. And we're going to start with the game right at the beginning of our session. And if we think back to last week's session, we started to talk about player engagement. And often what happens when players start to arrive at their session, and I guarantee one of the first questions you might get asked is, when are we playing a match or when are we playing a game? So therefore, probably the best way to be able to do that and sort of to maintain high levels of motivation with your players and engage them as quick as possible is start with a game. As they come into your session, it might be a 1v1, then a 2v1 and a 2v2, and you can just slightly build the game. So what you'll see on the screen is the whole part of the first part of the session. It's a 7v7 activity, which looks to focus three things. Firstly, as part of this session, we're looking at thinking about improving movement and finding, creating and exploiting space. We want to try and think about our players and trying to scan when they have and when they haven't got the ball and trying to find space on and around the pitch. What can they see and what are they aware of? And the other part of this session, and particularly these objectives, is around applying sort of different techniques, particularly in and around the box when finishing. And it almost builds on last week's session when we talked about 5 ways to score. So it's a good opportunity to link maybe your sessions together across a number of weeks as well. Now, if you look at the organisation, what we've done here is we've set an appropriate size pitch up for the appropriate age group, thinking about maybe a 7v7, and you could make it bigger if it was maybe more of an adult age group, thinking about the pitch that they play on, or you could make it smaller, thinking about the appropriate, again, size of the pitch for the age group you play on. But what you'll notice is we've split the pitch up here into 3 sections. So we've gone with thirds, widthways across the pitch. And we're trying to think about how we can build play up and looking at trying to challenge our players. And what we've done at the start with our game is put in a couple of little challenges, if you like. So again, that's related to the step framework we looked at last week. The space has been adapted because we've split it into thirds in order to try and think about how we might build the play up through the thirds. The tasks which we're going to provide, first and foremost in this particular practice, are for every goal, for a goal to count, all the score sort of team outfield players must be in the top 2/3 of the pitch. So if my blue players are attacking, obviously against the yellow goalkeeper, all the blue players need to be in the middle third or the final third for the goal to be able to count. So they're really going to squeeze up the pitch a little bit. Another little sort of challenge we might put on there is a one-touch finish would count as 2 goals. So we're starting to think about maybe challenging the players and how they finish and how they might score goals, maybe with different surfaces of the foot. It might be the instep, it might be laces, volleys, okay? And the final little challenge I might put on here is a 1-2 combination. So it could be that if we do find that we're in an overload, we just talked about overloads, in a 2v1 situation, I might lend the ball to Tom. I might move into space and Tom might give the ball back to me in a bit of space, which allows me then to try and score off my first touch. Actually, that could lead to 3 goals. So we're trying to incentivize a bit of creativity and a bit of combination in and around the box to try and score. Ultimately, what you can see here is a game with those 3 challenges playing 7v7. What you'll also see in terms of organisation around the pitch is a number of footballs. So as one ball goes out, what we have an opportunity to do is a player will, we might say to the player, go and get the nearest football to you that can start. And that can start with a throw in or it can start with a kick in. Now, for me, actually, I'd like to keep it as realistic as possible. And often we see young kids, they really struggle with throw-ins. So actually, it's a great opportunity to try and get lots of repetition at throwing the ball in to try and help them with that technique as well. So it helps them within their match. Another way that I've done this before, actually, is called keep it on the pitch. So actually, it could be that if the yellow team, if let's say they've kicked the ball out, the player that's kicked that ball out goes to get it, whilst the blue player, who's maybe nearest to the next ball, starts the practice off. So you're almost creating a little bit of an overload there as well in order to start the game again quickly. And it might create a little counter-attacking opportunity as well. And the yellow player can replace where the new ball has started from. So it constantly replenishes the footballs in and around the pitch. So once we've done this, maybe for, let's say, we've got a 60-minute session, my first 15, let's say 15, 20 minutes of the session is this game. Focusing on those 3 challenges and playing a game. Really high levels of engagement and lots of little challenges for the players. What we then might do is I'm just going to start to break it down into what we call... Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Can we just, before we go into the part, we've had a question come through about how might you simplify this? So because you coach under sixes or under sevens, remind me, Gaz.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So again, I think it's really important. I think, like you said, when we present the practices, that we start to think about it in context. So how can I take this practice and start to put it in your context that you work in? So for me, this might be a 4v4, for example, on a smaller sized area. It could be that we have maybe just one task in there. So in the resource that we'll share with you in the chat bar shortly, which is sets out this practice, there are 3 specific tasks that we could set the players at the start. But actually, if you're working with a younger age group, let's not overload them. Let's give them just one task. And it might be a one-touch finish counts as 2 goals. Or it might be that if they can combine with a teammate and get it back and then score, they might get 3 goals. It might just be as simple as that. Okay? So we can think about the number and the amount of tasks that we give the players for that. So once we've...
Can I add to that, Gaz? Sorry.
Go on then, Paul.
Just something I kind of threw in the chat there, because that was brought up by quite a few people. Remember, the point of the practice is for players to learn. So if you equate it to school, they're challenged in school. If that lesson doesn't work, they'll revisit that lesson and do it again and do it again until the learning takes place. They don't just abandon it. So don't underestimate the players. The first time you might do it might be absolute chaos. The next time you do it, in say 2-3 weeks' time, 2 or 3 of the players might get it. You then do it in 4 weeks' time, 5 or 6 of the players get it. You know, your practice is not there to look perfect. The practice is there to help the players learn. That's a big one for me.
Yeah, I love that, Paul. And I think those moments where I think what you're mentioning there is often there might be some mistakes that happen. So let's allow them to make those mistakes. Let's give them the opportunity to make mistakes and actually let's allow them to see if they can self-correct, which we talked about last week, because sometimes that's the most powerful bit of coaching that we can do. So what I'm showing you on screen now is how we might be able to split the game up into a part practice. And again, this is a little question I think there for the coaches on the call. How many of you on the call this evening maybe coach on your own? And how many of you that say co-coach? So you have a coach that works with you in your session that supports your session as well. So if you think about the previous practice, okay, so we had a game here. We played 7v7, okay? What I've created on the screen now is the same sized area, okay? So we've got a number of footballs that we can place around the area as well. So let's add our footballs in. So we might have 2 here, 2 here, might have 2 here, put 2 footballs there on the side here, and on the side here as well. So we've got lots of footballs around the area, okay? And what we've done is we've split it, so we've mirrored the practice. And what I mean by that is whatever happens on the left-hand side, okay? So whatever happens on this particular side here, okay, is happening exactly the same on the other side. It might be an opportunity where you could split your teams into 2 groups, where one coach could look after the team on the group on the right, and one coach might be able to look at the group on the left. Now, in terms of organization, what I've done here is created overloads, a 4v2 or a 4v3, if we include our goalkeeper in that. That's very important, because sometimes we neglect our goalkeeper and just think they need to go in goalkeeper's corner and just have lots of shots smashed at them, okay? We need to include them in the practice as much as possible. So if we look at the left-hand side, okay, so we're just going to focus on this side of the pitch to begin with, okay, because this is where I want to focus our attention. So the Reds, for example, they will start attacking by picking up, let's say, the first football, which might be here, okay, and then they're going to attack 4v2 at this goal here, okay, and their objective with the same 3 tasks that we mentioned at the start of this particular session, which was if we can finish with a one-touch finish, that might count as 1 goal. If we can think about maybe combining with one of our players and getting it back in space and then scoring, then that might count as 3 goals. But what these 4 red players get is a lots of repetition at trying to attack against those 2 players to be able to try and score in and around the box. So can we get some really good foxes in the box? And that's the link to the title. Okay, subliminal link there. All right, so we can start to think about different ways that we can adapt this. And again, question for the coaches on the call this evening. Now that you understand the layout of this practice, how could we start to use the step principle, or the step framework, sorry, that we introduced last week to adapt this session to meet the needs of the players? Or how could we use the step framework to challenge the players accordingly? So I'll give you 30 seconds or so to put a few ideas back into the chat bar. There's a great question that's coming from Tom Jackson, and we did touch upon this last week about transition. Okay, so my 4 red players that are playing against the 2 yellow players. if my yellow players win it, their challenge is, can they get the ball and dribble the ball back into this central area, this central scoring zone? And if they do that, they get to score a number of goals. And you could dictate that as a coach as well. Now, given that those two players are overloaded, you might put a number of points on, a higher number of points on that potentially, to really incentivize them, really trying to press and win that ball back. Because if they're pressing lots and trying to win the ball back, we're actually creating lots of spaces in that area that we can exploit as a red team. Good, so we can change the shape of this pitch. I've seen that one come through. So what we might be able to do, and I saw again, I think it was Dale Whiten who talked earlier about being able to funnel and channel sort of the pitch off into little sections. So what we might be able to do is to put a little markers along here and turn it into a bit of a diamond shape. So the pitch now becomes a bit more of a diamond. So we can reduce the size of area that we're playing in to challenge players even further. Okay, so we've got to think about, if I'm on the left-hand side, the red players have got to find as much width as possible, even though we've narrowed it off slightly, and it might minimize the space that's there to exploit. And the same on the right-hand side for my yellow players as well. So we could think about changing the size and the shape of area. Other things that we might provide is, and my question to you would be, would it matter if the game on the left-hand side that we've set up, the red 4 against the 3 yellows, would it matter if they're playing a slightly different version to the group on the right-hand side? And for me, I'd be quite happy if there were slightly different conditions in there with given the needs of the players. So the way I might group the players are appropriate in terms of their ability. I might have maybe a stronger group maybe on the left, and those that might need a little bit of an adapted version of the game on the right-hand side. But it's really important to think about that overload and that 4v2, because if we don't get the overload right, we might not create lots of things that we're trying to create in our game, which are lots of goal-scoring opportunities. Some other ideas that we've had come through the chat bar. We've got increase to one group, defense versus attack. Yep. So if you didn't have the numbers, you might be able to do it in maybe one area. Let's say you had 9 players at your session. It could be a 4v3 with a goalkeeper. So there's 8, and you might have a little target that the players try and play into. But the problem is around sometimes using targets is that reduces the level of engagement for that player who is the target for a period within their game. So we might need to think about rotating that around. So there's loads of different ways that you can think about this. Some of the key things I want you to take away is, when you split off into your part practice, how do you group them in order to gain some success in your session? What's the focus of your session? What are you trying to get out of? And therefore, how do you set up those little part practices? You might find it needs to be a 3v2. It might sometimes, if you haven't got a big number of players, it might be a 2v1 in each area. And if you're working with younger players, particularly 6s and 7s, it might be better to go down in terms of the numbers to a 2v1 and a 3v1, potentially even more so, okay, to really help them in terms of the understanding. And as you go up through the age groups, it might be that you change the numbers a little bit as well. Paul, Lee, Tom, anything else you've seen in the chat bar that we could adapt to?
I can't remember who mentioned it, so forgive me. But they asked a question around, I think they stated they were more of an attacking-minded coach, and their co-coach was a defensive-minded coach. Yep. And he said, would it be possible for the two to work together in that session and then bring it together? And I think I put in there, that's what co-coaching is. Co-coaching isn't, I have my go while Gaz goes off and gets a coffee and watches for 15 minutes. And then Gaz comes and does his bit, and then I go off somewhere else. Co-coaching is how you work together. So it might be one's working on the attack element, one working defensively. It might be one's running the overall session while your co-coach goes in and works with players individually. So there's a lot of ways to co-coach, but the title is in co-coaching. Not I have a go, then Gaz has a go, then I have a go. Try and plan to work together. And what you can do with players then is so much more powerful.
Great stuff. I think the other thing that I've done with this type of practice, particularly with the younger players, to help their focus, because often you can get the few daisy pickers that sort of just picking the grass and looking around and not really engaged in the activity, is what you can maybe do is number the footballs that are around the pitch. So if you look at the left-hand side, I've effectively got 6 footballs from the top left all the way around to the bottom left. It might be in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay. And when one ball goes out, I'll then call the next number of the ball where I want the red team to start from. And actually, straight away, the yellow players are reacting to where that ball is and that moment of the game, for example, so we can start to think about keeping them on task and really keeping them focused in the game. Once we've been through that first round of 6, we can then change the players around. I think it's important that we rotate those players around so they get opportunities to have a go in lots of different positions and they get lots of different challenges, obviously age appropriate and where appropriate for the needs of the players as well. The final thing that I would do once I've done this in the middle part of my session, because remember this is the part activity, is I would take it straight back into my game, because that's where we're going to finish, and we're going to take it back into the game to see if there's been any progress and any more development in what we've tried to get out of our session, which is finding, creating and exploiting those spaces, developing and trying to create lots of movement off and around the ball, and trying to think about how many times that we can create those goal scoring opportunities. And with the tasks and the challenges that we provide, incentivizing that with a point scoring system. And as coaches, we can either come up with that ourselves, or we can give a bit of ownership to the players. They could come up with that point scoring system as well, if they wanted to. And if they come up with it, they're almost playing to their own rules. So they might help them in terms of that level of engagement as well with the practice.
Superb. Thank you, Gaz. Coaches, if you have got any questions, pop it into the chat and Gaz will do his best to respond over the next 5 minutes. I'll leave the session pinned in the chat. So if you want to go and find the website of that session with the whole, the part and the whole, you can do. And whilst it is just a small part of the success of this session, doing it in a whole way, starting with the game, it gets rid of that really annoying question that every kid, and even every adult, asks us when they first turn up to training. Coach, when we play a game, just start with it. It's a game changer if you haven't tried it before.
Lee, can I just come in with one more thing there, just in terms of how we set the practices up, is that sometimes when we coach, the hardest thing is the plan. What we've done is we've delivered 3 parts of a session in one area of the pitch that we haven't really needed to adapt. So if you look at what you can see on screen, we set up our pitch with our 3 zones. We then went into our part practice, and all we did was split the group into 2 areas of the same pitch. And then we've put them back into a game where we haven't needed to adapt the size or shape of the area. And actually we can help with our transitions through the session. We often find, particularly with new coaches, is they'll set up one area with a practice and then we'll stop that one and go, right, give me 5 minutes while I set up the next bit of practice. But actually what that's doing is eating into the amount of time that the ball can be rolling for our players. So the more that we can plan our sessions with a minimal amount of sort of disruption of setting practices up, because what quite easily you could do is take out those 2 middle lines and you create your whole pitch then for that final part of the session as well. So just a couple of things to think about in terms of how we plan our sessions to help with those transitions and maximize the amount of time that the ball rolls for the player.